A change to the Shadowbringers healing meta that makes you more of a pure healer. You think you do, but you don't. And you won't. This is MultimediaJay Radio Style for Sunday, June 9th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay Radio Style.
Well, as we head towards launch day for Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, I am starting to hear the same things over and over again. One of them is, should the meta for healers in Final Fantasy XIV change to more pure healer and less of what's there right now, where you throw heals to keep the party alive and then do damage the rest of the time? I'm also hearing comparisons to World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth, and people are worried about Shadowbringers being another BFA. And I'm here to respond to both of those and say, no, Final Fantasy fans, you do not want either of those things. And instead of being worried about Shadowbringers being the next BFA, what you need to be worried about is Shadowbringers being the next Cataclysm. Now, older veteran players like myself who've been around the MMO landscape as long as we have, we've basically been involved with this stuff long enough to notice patterns as well as history repeating itself. All this talk about the healer meta in Shadowbringers, and we might go pure healer, what might be interesting, it'll add some more depth to the gameplay, and all I can think of is Final Fantasy players are absolute sitting ducks for what happened in Cataclysm with healers. So I'm going to post a link in the description for those of you to play some catch-up who may not be familiar with what happened back in those days, or maybe you're one of the younger gamers out there who just plain wasn't around when this happened. But we do not want history to repeat itself. Now, I mentioned earlier in the discussion about how Final Fantasy XIV should not chase after World of Warcraft, as in trying to dethrone WoW at this point. I think Final Fantasy has more than enough oomph as an IP, so to speak, to forge its own path and not have to copy another game. Unfortunately, what I've seen from Final Fantasy XIV is that it has picked up where, in some cases, Wrath of the Lich King left off. So yeah, there are some elements of WoW's heyday in Final Fantasy XIV, but it's not the good ones. For example, you go to run a dungeon, again. Nobody cares about the dungeon, nobody cares about the story, nobody cares about the lore, nobody cares about whether or not you're still going through the initial quests in the main story or whatnot. Nobody cares about anything except getting it done as quickly as possible. Not even a full clear for experience, not even a full clear for treasure, and newer dungeons have actually become more and more like tunnels, which, by the way, was a criticism going all the way back to Burning Crusade, that the dungeons in the original game felt more like explorable dungeon areas, and yet the dungeons in Burning Crusade were turning into hallways, where you go down the hall, there's a boss. You go down another hall, there's a boss. You go down another hall, there's the final boss, and what do you know, there's a convenient one-way shortcut back to the beginning of the dungeon through some kind of locked door or something after you beat the boss. So these were dungeons that were not made to feel like places in the actual world, but they're dungeons that were made to be cleared and cleared and cleared and eventually become part of the grind. It's very uninspired design, and it's a very, very old problem in MMOs. But what do you do as game developers when the player base wants this stuff because they've stopped valuing the outdoor world and things like that, and because you've made them feel like they have to grind? Now all they care about is how efficient the grind is. They've completely checked out from what it is that you're trying to create. All they want to do is speed clear everything. That's what happened to the dungeon meta in Wrath of the Lich King. That is what Final Fantasy XIV has inherited, and I don't consider this to be a good thing. Because if history keeps repeating itself, we're looking at probably the most miserable expansion for healers that we've seen as of yet. Let's take a look at this old Ghostcrawler article. Actually, before we get to the Ghostcrawler article from way back in Cataclysm, if you search Google right now for why does Blizzard hate healers, some of these thread names for some of these forum results will let you know that even though this thing we're looking at right now is from 2010, this argument and this discussion has not only continued to this day, but it has also expanded into other Blizzard games like Overwatch. Let's read a few of these headlines on some of these forum topics. Why does Blizzard hate support so much? That's from Overwatch. People still won't play healer. Overwatch, January 2018. Hate towards healers. Overwatch forums. Blizzard Entertainment, July 2017. Why do people hate to play healers? June 2017. Blizzard, do you hate healers? Again, from Overwatch, May 7th, 2017. And then we get to the WoW forums. Healing in WoW is not fun. November 2018. Why do people hate Mercy? Okay, this must be more general Blizzard type stuff. So that would be, so that's July 2018. For tanks or healer mains, a message from a DPS. Why do DPS? So a lot of these discussions, why I hate healing, why do people hate healers? Why does Blizzard hate healers? All of this stuff is the descendant of this old discussion, but now it has expanded out of World of Warcraft into Overwatch. So this is not a new thing. And let's take a look at what was fundamentally flawed when this article from 2010 was making the rounds and starting drama in the forums. But before we get to this article, I gotta stop delaying things here. A little bit of a background into the healer meta in WoW throughout its existence. The game began with pure healers. The idea of combat healers came later. In the early days of the game, healers were so terrible at doing damage that it was not uncommon, right before the spell damage for healers came out in Burning Crusade, for priest mains to have rogue alts. And they would basically, anyone playing a healer would get leveled up by their guild for the purposes of healing in raids. So, or they would level as DPS, then pay to respec, but nobody would play healer on their own because the damage was so terrible. They would either get boosted up by their friends running dungeons, that way they could speed right into the raid team, or they would level as DPS and then switch over. The idea of a combat healer just did not exist in the early days of the game. Even Shockadins in PvP were turning heads like, wait, that healer just blew me up with Holy Shock for 3,000 damage. What the heck happened? So it took some getting used to. But going into Cataclysm, up to the end of Lich King, the healer toolbox was basically fast heals and slow mega heals. So if someone really got pummeled by a boss and you knew they weren't going to get pummeled again, you could essentially heal slam them with the huge heal that took a little longer to cast. But the issue with this was you eventually got to the point where the fast heal was the one everyone was always using because it's all you needed. You'd save the big heals for when someone really got slammed, like a tank or something during a high damage phase or something along those lines. So eventually when regeneration got to the point where it was at the end of Lich King, healer mana was not an issue. It stopped being an issue and you just stood there spamming Flash of Light, at least when people were taking damage. If people played smartly, maybe you could actually join the offense as a healer. Maybe. But the big thing was, quite frankly, that Blizzard did not like the one-dimensional gameplay of, oh, nobody's dying. Yay! I feel like I'm in God mode now because I have X amount of gear. So, what do? They nerf the heck out of healer mana, and then they totally redesign the healing toolbox, so the fast heal is now the emergency heal that is super expensive. And so what we wound up with initially with Cataclysm was three kinds of heals. The super heal was still what it was. Then there would be a fast emergency heal that wouldn't be as powerful as the super heal, but it'd be faster. And then there would be the general slow, not very much heal. And that's where the problems came from, because in order to not run out of mana, you actually wound up spending more time spamming the regular heal and less time getting to do other things like move or join offense or cast buffs or decurse or whatever. Decurse, that's kind of old school, but anyways, dispelling things. Of course, you did have instants for that in most cases, so... But that's the big thing here, and the big reason why people knew that Blizzard was completely out of touch with the player base at the time, is that all of this that is talked about in this article about, oh yeah, we need to have more depth to the healing gameplay, and healers need to start picking the right heals for the right job, and the consequences need to be that they run out of mana if they don't. The problem is, and the one thing that was not mentioned in this discussion until players brought it up, is that unlike DPS, healers could be blamed very easily if someone else screwed up. That has been the scourge of playing any kind of dedicated healer in that game, and as we saw with the Overwatch complaints, other games that have come out since then. Just blame the healer, blame the healer, blame the healer. That's the easy way out. Oh, so-and-so standing in the fire. They get blown up by AE, whatever. Just blame the healer. And that is completely missing from this discussion. If you look at why does Blizzard hate healers, what you find is that Ghostcrawler is looking at the healers' gameplay as though they were the only ones in the entire party, that everyone else was bots or something like that. But that's not the case. There were real problems with real people playing real players, running real DPS that would not stand in the right spot, or they would care more about their numbers and getting the mechanics correctly, wouldn't understand the rather simple idea that a dead DPS does no damage, and they would blame the healer for things that were going wrong. And I still get this even this year in Final Fantasy XIV in the worst pickup groups that I've had. And as I've mentioned before we got to this article, this discussion is still going on, not just in Overwatch, but even in WoW itself. So a nearly 10-year-old discussion at this point, and we're still having it. So obviously those changes in Cataclysm didn't solve things. And what's more, some of them were rolled back. Like, for example, I think that there were 3 kinds of heals, eventually became 2 kinds of heals. So there was efficient or fast emergency and stuff like that. There was no super heal or something. One of those was taken out, I think. But the big complaint was that because the only heal that wouldn't run you out of mana or overheal the target was the slow one, now you were stuck spamming more and you couldn't really do anything. So this idea of getting away from spamming completely didn't happen. Now, in Final Fantasy, if this were to happen, if the meta were to change, and we saw healers go from they keep everybody, the best healers can keep everybody alive and contribute to the fight, to more pure healer type stuff, where the healers have to be kept busy more and more often, the thing to watch for would be a situation where healing became completely one-dimensional. The healers absolutely needed to check out from the fight because otherwise people were going to die from their wounds because they missed a healing target or they ran out of MP or something like that. That's the thing to watch for. And that's the criticism that I have in this discussion anyways for this idea of blindly chasing after Blizzard's success, because Blizzard's success wasn't without its caveats, and this was one of them. To this day, if you queue for Dungeon Finder, you can expect your damage queues to be longer in many games than the healer or the tank in dungeon groups. You're going to wait a lot longer to get a dungeon group in those things because of, and this is something that has not gone away. We're getting to decades now. We're getting into this being a decades-long problem in these games where everybody wants to DPS and nobody wants to be blamed by a bunch of bad players because the DPS stood in the fire or something, or the healer got starved for resources because of the idiot standing in the fire, so the tank went down or something. Come to think of it, this also ties back to my previous discussion on how forced socialization is an MMO failure, because you eventually will run into people like this. If you're not able to run with friends all the time, you're eventually going to run into people like this, and it's going to be a very miserable experience. Now let's get to the part of the discussion where people are going to think I'm shadowboxing an old demon or something like that I should have had this conversation back in 2010 instead of nowadays in June of 2019. Let's take a look at some of this. Those expensive fast heals were never a difficult choice. Expensive doesn't really apply in the absence of a cost, so they were just fast heals. Why wouldn't you want to cast a fast heal? Because, as a healer, I want to still be involved in the fight. A great example of games where this is a thing is the Battlefield series. You know, if you played a medic in Battlefield 1942, you still had a gun that was almost as powerful as the assault's gun, and you could still shoot at enemy players. You know, the difference was you had the bandages in order to heal a wounded teammate. So you lost some offensive power in order to gain the ability to bandage people up if they didn't go find a health locker or an ammo locker at the various checkpoints in the game. And you couldn't camp those anyways, because then you couldn't keep the flags capped and all that stuff, and you couldn't maintain your objectives if you were just goofing around cheesing things next to one of those cabinets. Plus, someone could always get you with a hand grenade. So so the game was balanced in that respect. But what we had with the classic Battlefield series was an environment where whoever the healers were not pure healers. So the best players would actually contribute to the fight while keeping everybody alive. Some of that has made its way into these RPGs as well, but the extent to which it's possible always depends upon the philosophy of the developers. World of Warcraft's healing meta in the early part of the game up until Cataclysm focused on the pure healer. The idea of healers being able to do other stuff besides heal was something that took a while to even show up. I think monks were where it really showed up for the first time. There was some attempts at offensive healing with some of the other classes, but the first officially supported the combat healer was the Fistweaver monk, and that was removed. So apparently, here we are again with Blizzard. Blizzy knows best, doubling down on their old ideas and things that have created the drama-loaded WoW community that exists today, that cries about everything and has been crying about everything for years. The second point that Ghostcrawler made back in the days of this Cataclysm debacle was, well, since healers aren't running out of mana, we'd had to design encounters that were designed to really be challenging. So the tank would get hit with huge tank damage, or the raid would be hit with huge raid damage. Oh, you mean tank busters that you have to be prepared to respond to? Gee, where have I seen that before? Yeah, that exists in Final Fantasy nowadays. But the idea and the reason why you needed a tank buster or a raid buster for boss moves and stuff like that, the reason why this was even an issue in Lich King was because the healing meta in the game was designed around pure healers. There wasn't really any combat healing at the time, and it wasn't really a thing that people, even though it existed in other games, it was not a thing in WoW and all the games that were trying to be WoW. There was some of it, but you'd see it mostly in PvP. But this idea of healers actually being part of the fight instead of standing there spamming heals on everybody, again, the underlying philosophy of pure healers first is why this was even a problem and why this stressed so many people out when heroics became hard again in early Cataclysm. And even to this day, Cataclysm heroics are basically considered a Blizzard screw-up in a lot of communities because people are like, yeah, well, the game needs to be more challenging, but then you get to the point where you have no chance of clearing a heroic if you're in any kind of dungeon finder group because most of the teammates will not have the group synergy to really tackle the dungeon very well. Let's look at the Ghostcrawler's third point from 2010 and talk about that as well. Anything that played off of regeneration, such as a talent or spirit or a proc from a trinket, became undesirable, so overhealing wasn't a concern because mana wasn't a concern. Yeah, well, if you think about using the right tool for the right job, part of that would mean that I want to spend as little time as I need to healing people so that way I can contribute to the fight. Because if the boss or the enemies go down quicker because more people are throwing damage at them, that's less you have to worry about healing because that's a shorter combat time overall. So, and this is the thing, of course, there was PvP balance, etc., things like that. You can check out the article if you want to see what the ideas were at the time, but it'll suffice to say the article doesn't mention what the response to this was. And the response to this was terrible. People were furious because they knew what was going to happen with especially the new heroics in Cataclysm, was that the healers were going to run out of mana just like that. They were going to get bashed by groups, kicked from groups, stuff like that. All the people that would be bad players no matter where they went were just going to do their thing as usual, and it would be the healers that would always suffer the consequences. And so we come to today where you can still find people talking about any game that has adopted the MMO Trinity. There's the argument between the healers and the DPS, and there's accusations that the developers don't like healers, and there's accusations that, there's people who want to play healers, they want to play tanks, or there's people whining about queue times. So we're heading towards decades of this being a problem. I'll have to look up when Dungeon Finder came out in Wrath. Actually, no, this is going into Cataclysm. Dungeon Finder was already out by then. So we are talking about this heading towards being a decades-long problem. And that is something we don't want to see in Shadowbringers. So the people that are curious about, I can be more of a pure healer in Shadowbringers, that's not going to be a good thing if that happens, because now your role is 100% one-dimensional. Spam away because the incoming damage is going to be so high, either because of the increased difficulty or because of the tank not knowing that things have changed and pulling too much, that you're going to have no chance to do anything else. So spam away and hope that everybody survives so you don't get blamed for the group wiping. Yeah, real fun. Sad to say, there's a smaller version of this in the current meta when you get a bad tank that doesn't understand that the AoE damage in Final Fantasy XIV is capped. So instead of just going through one group at a time, knocking them out, going on to the next one, and only stopping if, say, the healer needs MP or something like that, what I often see is, let's pull the entire room. So they pull the entire room, the healer starts spamming the heck trying to keep the tank alive, removes them from the DPS equation, so now you're down to 3 people doing damage instead of 4, and AoE damage is capped. So people stand there spamming AoEs that don't do a lot of damage to individual monsters until they can switch over to single target, but you just stand in one place. You pull the whole room, stand in one place being all stressed out until finally all the trash mobs die. Boy, does that sound like fun. /sarcasm. So like I said, and I might as well say it again, Final Fantasy XIV should not chase after WoW. Because even at the game's height of its popularity, World of Warcraft had its issues. It still has its issues today, but even when it was at 12 million subs, there were still issues. Just because you copy a previously successful model doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a good experience as a result. And I think anybody who played from Lich King into Cataclysm can definitely vouch for this if anybody in the rest of the Final Fantasy player base can actually acknowledge that this stuff has happened before, and if it happens again in Shadowbringers, it's not going to be a good thing. So I will continue viewing the Shadowbringer developments up until launch with a grain of salt, because things can still go quite wrong until the game launches, and they don't. So here's to hoping that the developers at Square Enix don't make the wrong decision here, because, like I mentioned earlier, chasing after WoW is not always the best idea, especially with an IP like Final Fantasy that's more than capable of carrying its weight without copying something else. This is MultimediaJay, signing off. Thanks for stopping by.